Hello, everybody. Welcome back to the Training, Learning, and Development Community's Accessible and Inclusive Design Conference, AIDC 23. Thanks for joining us. Let's see. Oh, yeah, we've got the room is filling up quite nicely. Everybody is back. Do me a favor, and if you can, just type in chat where your location is and just say hi, so I know that that we have you all here in the room with us now. So we're getting started a little bit early. Yeah, Kayleen saying, excited for your session, Susie.
Oh, brilliant.
One thing that I want to drop in real quick, and I'm going to pin it to the top, is Susie's, oops, it's disappearing because everyone's typing. Oh, never mind. I'll pin it later. It's gone. Susie actually did our inaugural AIDC 21 event. Susie did a presentation that was really like highly acclaimed, I would say. I had a couple universities let me know that particular set of resources, that event is part of a regular part of their curriculum now. And of particular note, they had mentioned that Susie's was really fantastic. So I have no doubt that that this session today is going to be absolutely fantastic as well. But before I go on with Susie's bio and all of that, I do want to mention two things. One, take advantage of the tables during the breaks. I know yesterday I saw like 3 tables were being populated, and those are really, really wonderful places to network. I know that for myself, every time I've participated in one of those tables, I've gotten so much value out of it just by meeting other folks. And so I know today Kayleen is hosting a table. Let me take a look. I think that she might be the only one on the schedule today. Oh, yeah, for today. Tuesday, Kayleen, yeah. But if anybody else wants a table, I know that there's an open table there. Some of the other speakers also have tables listed under their names. They may be showing up, but jump in there. It's great to connect with the community, connect to other people that might be able to provide resources for you, and just, make some friends. And then the second thing was Alan Natachu, who was scheduled to speak later today for the second session of the day, who's going to do our 10 a.m. Pacific time, 1 p.m. Eastern time session. Plain language is not as plain as you think. Has to reschedule that one. So he's going to do that one tomorrow for the late slot. Excuse me, Wednesday. I think that's going to be at 2 p.m. Pacific, 5 p.m. Eastern. That said, I don't know if anybody's out there that wants to take this 10 a.m. slot, but I'm open. Platform's open, so we could bring you in if you're interested. Just throwing that out there. And with that, let's get back to the star of the show, Susie Miller, who is an industry-leading expert on accessible learning design and the founder and director of,
Ella Hub.
Ella Hub. You've never I always just
it doesn't matter how you pronounce it.
Ella Hub, thank you. The author of Designing Accessible Learning Content, which I believed before AIDC 21, you had just released that book, which was so great. It was timely. The author of Designing Accessible Learning Content. Susie has over 30 years L&D experience in higher ed and the public, private, and third sectors, skilled instructional designer, an online course developer, and a passionate advocate for digital accessibility. Her accessible learning content has been shortlisted for the Learning Technology Awards, which that is really impressive. And so with that, I'm going to go ahead and let Susie take over, hide myself from the screen, and everybody enjoy. I know that this is going to be a fantastic session.
No pressure then. Okay, so just to start, I wanted really to welcome everyone to this, what I call a masterclass in accessible and inclusive learning content. And really, I just wanted to start by thanking Luis and the team for having me back and inviting me to run this session for you today. So I also wanted to thank you all for giving up your really valuable time to find out more about making learning content, both accessible and inclusive, whether you're joining us live or whether you're watching the recording. Okay, so what we're going to do first of all, I'll just begin by going through a brief outline of what we're going to cover today. So I'm going to start by setting the scene and addressing just a few key issues before we begin. So we'll start with some introductions and then move on to a useful definition and some important points around the case for making learning content accessible. And then I'll move on to some key insights and outline how accessible learning content leads to better learning practitioners and better experiences for everyone. Next, I'll focus on the taking action section, and that will have some practical tips on improving both the accessibility and inclusivity of content. So even those of you that are very familiar with this subject, I'm hoping that there'll be something that everybody can take away. And what we'll do is just finish with some key takeaways and then the opportunity for some questions if we have time. Also, as I'm going through the presentation, Luis is going to be in charge of the chat, and we've agreed that if he sees anything which is really vital or interesting as we're going along, then he's going to interrupt me. So hopefully when I just pause for breath, I've got quite a lot to cover, and I do sometimes get quite excited about what I'm talking about. So hopefully he can manage to pause me and stop me if there are any questions. And just one other point as well, there are some quite a few links as we're going through the presentation. So obviously I'll share those in the resources page at the end of the session, so you've got access to those. Okay, so what we'll do, as I said, is just start with our introductory scene setting section. So I'll just start with a little bit more background really about my own learning journey and really how I became to be so passionate about accessibility. So as Luis has said, I've been involved in L&D for over 30 years now, and I have worked across various different sectors, public, private and charity, and also in higher education. And it was really my experience when I was working in higher education where I realised, working as an instructional designer, just how little support there was for people who wanted to make their learning content accessible. That was one of the main reasons that I decided to start my own company, Ella Hub, and that's driven by the only slightly ambitious vision of making all learning content accessible and inclusive as the default. And it was also the reason that I wrote the book, Designing Accessible Learning Content, or DALC for short, I call it now. I wanted there to be a resource which was available for anyone, especially practitioners like me, who wanted practical support to help them apply these technical standards to learning content. So for the best part of 9-10 years now, really, I've been focused on digital and e-learning accessibility, how to train it, how to make it come alive, how to change behavior, and how to bed accessibility so that it doesn't go away. So another important part of my introduction is why I became so passionate about this subject. And I always think it's vital to start any session on accessibility with a focus on the people that it affects. So in my experience, this is the spark which makes accessibility come alive, and it motivates people to get on board. It's also one of the vital ingredients which makes accessibility stick. So in my case, the spark was a student called Farisai Moyo, and she was in my A-level English literature when I was teaching in a high school in Zimbabwe, very early on in my teaching career. Now, because Farisai was blind, she had a reader who read out her literature text to her, and this was another girl in our class called Mercy. So on the screen now, you can see a picture of Farisai and Mercy. So soon after I started teaching her, I realized that having to rely on Mercy to read out her literature text was actually holding Farisai back. Because she didn't have access to assistive technology at the time, we managed to get Farisai's literature texts in Braille. And the autonomy and the independence in her learning that this gave Farisai had a huge impact on me. She went on to pass her A-level and eventually trained to be a teacher herself. So to explain the impact that working with Farisai had on me, I'm going to read out an extract from my book. And I think it's just because I spent such a long time writing and rewriting this paragraph to get it just right that I wanted to share it with you. It touches on some key concepts about accessibility before we get started. So working with Farisai was one of the greatest privileges in my career. The experience forced me to reevaluate all of my assumptions about teaching and learning. It taught me to be more aware of the needs of my students and made me realize how important it was to be able to adapt to those needs, ultimately making me a better teacher. Even more importantly, however, it made me rethink my attitude to disability. Working with Farisai showed me that just how that her impairment in the form of her blindness was not in itself something that disabled her. She was just as bright and capable as the other students in her class, and with strategies and things that we could do to include her, that allowed her to become more confident and independent, and she was able to fulfill her potential. So this leads me on to a definition of disability, which I found really useful to clarify before moving on to explore this subject in more detail. So Farisai's story is a great demonstration of the social model of disability, and that's based on the idea that disability is caused by barriers which are created when products and services, and in our case in learning, are not designed to include people with different access needs. So if those barriers are removed, then someone who is disabled can have an equal experience to everyone else. And for me, this definition of disability from the UNCRPD does a great job of articulating this concept. It says that persons with disabilities include those who have long-term physical, mental, intellectual, or sensory impairments, which, and here's the key bit, in interaction with various barriers, may hinder their full and effective participation in society on an equal basis with others. So this focus on barriers is a vitally important theme when we consider accessibility. And this is because if a disability is partly caused by barriers, then every single one of us has the ability to find out about those barriers and enable equal access for all of our learners by removing them. And that, I believe, is the power of accessibility. At a time when we're acutely aware of the problems we face as a society, accessibility gives us the power to make a hugely positive impact on the lives of so many people. And this is why part of this session and every session I deliver will focus on some practical accessibility tips that everyone can implement. But before we move on to the practical tips in this session, I just want to take a bit of time to focus on the case for accessibility. Although I appreciate that many of you will already be aware of the benefits of making digital and learning content accessible, I found that if I highlight a few or key organizational benefits at the beginning of a session, it can really help to engage people and make sure that everyone is on board. And this is a technique I thoroughly recommend if you find yourself having to advocate for accessibility in your organization, something that anyone who is passionate about accessibility, I'm sure, will have experienced. So I've just pulled out the top 3 benefits which I have found to have the most impact when I am advocating for accessibility. So the first one to focus on is how accessibility can help organizations to enhance their reputation. And the basis of this case really is that it's unethical and contrary to human rights to unnecessarily exclude disabled people from any aspect of life. So many people are aware that making learning content accessible is just the right thing to do, but not so many might be aware that this is a concept which is enshrined in international law, again by the UNCRPD. And this exists to enable persons with disabilities to live independently and participate fully in all aspects of life. And an important aspect of the UNRCPD, which many people aren't aware of, is that Article 9 specifically refers to access to information and communications technologies and systems as a fundamental human right. Another strong argument for this case is the UN Sustainable Development Goals. These were adopted by the UN General Assembly in 2015. They include 17 goals, building on the principle of leaving no one behind. Now, the SDGs explicitly include disability and persons with disabilities 11 times. The one we shout at most at Ella Hub is number 10, reduced inequalities. It means a lot to us that we're part of a global movement for sustainable change. Let's move on now to the legal case, and this is where accessibility tends to most commonly sit for organisations. And that, I think, can be a real shame because it promotes the mindset that accessibility is a risk and a constraint rather than an opportunity. But it's definitely an important consideration that we need to be aware of. We'll have a very quick look now at an overview of the international web accessibility laws and policies from W3C. And that really is to show you that there's this common theme, and that is that most legislation is underpinned by the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines, or WCAG, as I'm sure many of you are very aware. But this is why the W3 states that the WCAG standards are a single shared standard for web content accessibility that meets the needs of individuals, organisations and governments internationally. So we don't have time in this session to explore the legal side of accessibility in detail, but I do think it's always a really important, useful reminder that meeting accessibility standards is a legal requirement for many organisations, and it's increasingly being considered best practice for everyone else. So my last point, and one that I think is becoming more and more important to organisations, is that a commitment to diversity, equity and inclusion is really only legitimate if it encompasses all lenses of diversity, and this includes disability. So to explore that further, we'll look now at some statistics from the World Economic Forum. So in research carried out in 2019, they found that 90% of companies prioritize diversity. But what percentage do you think considered disability? So you don't need to share this in the chat, you just have a think yourself if you want to. But we have three options here: 4%, 14% or 24%. So just have a guess yourself about which one of those you think, what percentage is actually considering disability. So in actual fact, the answer is a staggering 4% considering disability. Now, I'm not quite sure how those figures would stand today, but judging by my own experience about how many organisations really understand or create legally accessible learning content, I'd actually guess that 4% is probably quite an accurate estimate. Which brings me to my last slide in the section and a fantastic key takeaway from an organisation called Disability is Diversity. They make the point that there is no diversity, equity and inclusion without disability. And of course, that also means accessibility. Their campaign is aimed at the entertainment industry in the US, but I think it's equally relevant for the L&D industry, or indeed all organisations who seek to have a legitimate commitment to diversity, equity and inclusion. So that concludes our scene setting section. I hope it's been a useful introduction and it's helped to highlight some of the organisational benefits of making learning content accessible before we move on. So my next section is called Key Insights. And one of the things that struck me, or I should say more accurately, really added to my imposter syndrome when I was writing the book, was that I only really had my own experience and that of a handful of other colleagues that I could draw on. But since then, my work with Ella Hub has given me the huge privilege of working with a whole range of organisations committed to making their digital and learning content both accessible and inclusive. I've just put together this infographic to give you an idea of the scope of what we've delivered over the last few years. And crucially, that includes providing support to over 55 UK, European, US and international clients. And this is that, as this selection of some of our clients shows, this has also included organisations in the private, public, federal, charity and education sectors, and also L&D providers. And this is where the real learning has taken place. Providing consultancy, auditing and especially training has allowed me some incredibly valuable insights, both into the benefits of accessible learning content, but also into the issues that people are having making their learning content accessible. So what I'm going to focus on for the rest of this session are the key insights that I've learned from that experience. As Maya Angelou once said, do the best you can until you know better. Then when you know better, do better. So when I wrote DALC, I was doing the best I could at the time. Now, particularly after seeing so many examples of non-accessible learning content made accessible, I can do even better. So we'll start off with my number one evidence-based key insight, which is that creating accessible learning content definitely, unequivocally, and 100% leads to better learning practitioners. This is something that I've been convinced of for a long time, but I'm really aware that that's an easy claim to make. So I'm going to now take the opportunity to share how both the evidence that I've gained from working with so many organisations and also my own experience as a learning practitioner back this up. So in the case of my own experience, I've spent the last 8 months working on transforming my book into an interactive and fully accessible online self-access program. You'll see quite a lot of examples from this as I go through the presentation. I'll give you more details about how you can get involved with the taster module of the program at the end of the session. So working on this resource has given me the opportunity to really walk the walk and talk the talk for accessible learning content, and it's undoubtedly made me a much better learning practitioner. I've also had feedback from many of the delegates that I've trained that they've experienced the same thing. So how does designing and developing accessible learning content make better learning practitioners? First and most importantly, finding out how to make learning content accessible shifts the emphasis to a focus on the learner, because considering accessibility is a fundamental and transformational shift, which puts learners at the center of the learning experience. In other words, it encourages learning practitioners to think with empathy about their learning audience. This is particularly the case in my own experience. This is our screen reader tester, Kirsty Wolf. Now, she runs her own language training and podcasting business. She's got a lived experience of a disability and has been using screen readers and assistive technology for over 20 years now. Working closely with Kirsty has been transformational in shifting my focus onto the experience of the learner. It's now impossible for me to design learning content without considering the different ways my learners will access that learning experience that I'm creating. And for organizations or people who don't have access to working with people with lived experience of a disability, even just encouraging them to work with access needs personas, particularly using the many video resources which can be found on platforms like YouTube and Vimeo, just has led to a noticeable improvement in their focus on putting learners at the center of the learning experience. The second reason that I've identified that leads to better learning practitioners is because it forces them to challenge their existing practice. The best way I've found of describing what happens when you find out about accessibility as a learning practitioner comes from a quote from the writer Alvin Toffler. Now, he once said, "The illiterate of the 21st century will not be those who cannot read or write, but those who cannot learn, unlearn, and relearn." So while not everyone may agree with these concepts of unlearning and relearning, it really is for me the best description I found of what happens to your practice as a practitioner, or instructional designer, and a developer when you design accessible learning content. It shifts the narrative from I'm doing this because it's the way I've always done it to I'm doing this because it benefits my learners. So to give you an example of what that can look like, this is a case study from my work with the L&D team of a government client. And it demonstrates how accessibility training had a positive impact on the screen recording content in their learning resources. So the department created a lot of instructional videos on how to use systems. Before their accessibility training, a lot of those screen recordings were created without a great deal of preparation. But as soon as learning practitioners realized they needed to add captions and transcripts to the videos, it made them create a script for each one. Not only did that make it much more efficient to make them accessible, but it also led to much more planned and professional recordings throughout all of their learning. So a real positive benefit there. Next, one that we're going to have a look at is this leading to innovation. Another hugely important benefit for learning practitioners is that because you have to think differently, it does lead to this idea of being able to design and develop differently and innovatively. So a profound change in mindset, I think, is when you realize that accessibility equals innovation, not limitation. I'll share one of these, an example now, and it's probably one that I shared 3 years ago, so bear with me if it is. So it's just an example of an interactivity I created for students at a university. And this was a case where there was a clear learning justification for using a drag and drop interactivity. And that was to reinforce the use of recycling bins as close as we could, getting to what they would actually do on campus. So because the drag and drop activity in the authoring tool wasn't accessible, I combined an accessible multiple response question with animation paths to create a drag and drop interactivity. And that was both accessible to keyboard and screen reader users, as you can see here. So as Luis very kindly said at the beginning, this was actually what the project that was shortlisted for the learning technologies. And I don't bring that up just to say, oh, I'm a fantastic designer, but it really is my best argument to prove that actually accessibility can lead to great learning because it leads to thinking differently and to innovation. So those are just a few ways that I found that designing content which is accessible leads to better learning practitioners. But here's the thing. Those better learning practitioners are designing and developing better learning experiences for everyone. because accessible learning content definitely, unequivocally, and 100% leads to a better learning experience for all learners, including people who have disabilities and access needs. So let's find out a bit more about why that is now. So we'll start with a benefit that you'd probably expect, and that is that accessible learning content includes people with a whole range of access needs. So again, we'll go through these very quickly, as I'm sure many of you are familiar with these different access needs. So for digital content, we most often divide those into vision, hearing, motor, and cognitive access needs. And this covers some conditions such as we can see we've got for vision, we've got blindness, low vision. I'll just run through these quickly. I think a lot of people are aware of these now. You can see some conditions for hearing, and then motor we have here as well, and then cognitive. So just have a if you're not so familiar with those, it's just a useful reminder, I think. So they're really just a few examples of the huge range of conditions that could affect any of our current or future learners. So according to some very interesting research by the Boston Consultancy Group, which came out, I think, just last month or a few weeks ago, that involved nearly 28,000 employees across 16 countries. Most organizations typically estimate that this applies to somewhere between 4% to 7% of their staff. However, the actual figure was closer to 25% of employees identify as having a disability or a health condition. So we're very often unaware of the prevalence of disability in our organizations, because according to the global charity Hidden Disabilities, and they use the sunflower symbol to help people show they have a disability which you can't see, up to 80% of disabilities are non-visible. So I always think that's worth reminding ourselves. And remember also that with population aging predicted by the UN to be one of the most significant social transformations of the 21st century, it's absolutely crucial that we make sure that our learning content is suitable for a workforce who will naturally experience a range of access needs as they get older. But even without the aging factor, accessibility is vital for future-proofing our content, because according to the Employers' Disability Forum, 2% of the working age population becomes disabled every year. 78% of disabled people acquire their impairment age 16 or older. So to summarize, making our learning content accessible is really the only way we can be sure that we are including everyone in our workforce and audience, which will most definitely already have people with disabilities and access needs in it now. And it's also the only way we can be certain our learning content is going to be fit for purpose for our potential workforce and audience of the future. And that's why I believe it's so important to adopt an accessibility as the default approach. So let's move on now to our next tangible benefit of accessible learning content, and that is that it caters for our learners' circumstances, environments, and preferences. So we'll start with circumstantial or temporary access needs. And again, I'm sure the majority of you are very familiar with this idea and examples. So we'll just run through a few of these very quickly as a reminder. So we'll do that again by focusing on the 4 different access needs categories. So the picture on the screen is a clue really as to a temporary motor access need. So we can have something which stops you being able to use your mouse, such as an injured hand or wrist. We could have a vision impairment, such as a blurred vision due to eye surgery, hay fever, or lost reading glasses, a hearing loss due to a head cold, exposure to loud noise, blocked ears, etc., and having impaired cognitive ability due to tiredness, stress, and anxiety, something that I think nearly all of us have probably experienced. So remember, these are things that could affect any of us or any of our learners at any time. So we'll move on now to situational or environmental access needs. And for this one, we'll focus specifically on things which could affect people who are interacting with our learning content. Again, the picture is an example of a motor access need, and one that you might recognise from COVID and lockdowns. So we have learning while caring for children when home working. And for vision access needs, we could have learning on site with sunlight obscuring the screen, or slow internet when working at home, which prevents pictures from downloading. For hearing access needs, we could have learning on a noisy factory floor. For cognitive access needs, we could have learning in a distracting home or office environment. So I think it's really important to say at this point that many disabled learners can find it frustrating when we use temporary and situational access needs just to justify making our learning content accessible. And I completely understand this point of view. But I think that one advantage it does have is that it shifts the emphasis away from the us versus them thinking and moves us simply to us thinking. Accessibility is something that can benefit any of us or any of our learners at any time. So by making our learning content accessible, we automatically cater to our learners' circumstances and environments. But it can also help us to accommodate different learner preferences. And this is because in order to make our learning accessible, we very often provide alternative ways of accessing the content. We'll have a look at that now in action in another example from the DALT program. So this example shows a scenario block which is not accessible for someone who uses a screen reader in the tool that's been used to create this content. To make it accessible, I provided a text version of the scenario in an accordion block, but I've designed that block so that it still gives learners the opportunity to reflect and consider before I give the suggested correct answer or feedback. So this alternative would work equally well for a screen reader user or for a learner who didn't want to work through every stage of the scenario activity. I'll never forget the feedback I once had from a learner who told me on their evaluation form that they loathed and detested scenario interactivities. So this approach of providing our learners with alternative methods of accessing content also lies at the heart of Universal Design for Learning, or UDL. And this is a well-recognized and established framework designed to optimize learning for everyone, and it's based on scientific insights into how humans learn. Central to the UDL framework is the principle of providing multiple means of engagement, representation, and action and expression. So ultimately, accessible learning content adapts to a range of circumstances, environments, and preferences. It caters for a wider audience, and it provides a richer learning experience for everyone. Another thing that accessible learning content does is to tackle common complaints about e-learning. Although, of course, this isn't always the case, I do think it's true to say that many of us are aware that digital learning doesn't always have the best reputation. So unlike UDL, which is based on scientific insights, this list of common complaints is based on nothing more than a quick poll of some of my connections on LinkedIn. These are some of the most common issues that they identified. Poor color contrast making content difficult to read, stressful and unhelpful assessments, distracting moving transitions and content, locked or difficult to navigate content, distracting narration on slides. And here's the thing about these complaints. They can all be fixed by following the standards and recommendations set out in the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines. So this brings us on to the final benefit of accessible learning content, which is that it leads naturally to inclusive learning. But before we explore that further, we really need to unpack the difference between the two. Now, although I used to use them interchangeably, it's really been my experience over the last few years that has been instrumental really in demonstrating why and how they're different. That's because even if we follow WCAG standards and make our content accessible, that doesn't necessarily mean that it's inclusive. As this still from the video accessibility versus inclusion shows, if we focus just on accessibility, it can be the equivalent of a person in a wheelchair being shown to their restaurant table, through the kitchen, past the toilets, whilst their companions are welcomed through the front door. In my experience, by focusing on accessibility, you naturally start creating inclusive content. And that is learning that provides a welcoming, engaging, and enjoyable learning experience for everyone. This is learning where no one feels excluded or has a lesser experience than anyone else. And of course, in its widest sense, that means considering every lens of diversity, equity, and inclusion. But for the purposes of this session, we're just going to focus on people with disabilities and access needs. So we'll look now at some tangible ways that we can do this. So here are just a few of the inclusive learning recommendations we make to our clients in our audits. You'll notice that none of them are about meeting WCAG standards. They all just focus on how we can make learners with access needs feel welcomed and considered. So the first, adding an accessibility statement, is a legal requirement for many organisations. But even if it isn't, it's a fantastic way of showing that you're committed to accessibility and are doing your very best to consider everyone's access needs. Another thing we suggest is using inclusive language, which doesn't make any assumptions about how people interact with content. So things like using select instead of click or enter instead of type, etc. So not a WCAG standard around this, just something that will help people to feel included and welcomed. One to avoid now, and that's using text all in capital letters. According to gov.uk, this makes it between 13 to 18% more difficult for learners to read, but it's particularly difficult for some people with dyslexia. So most of us know to avoid this in our day-to-day digital content because it's considered similar to shouting, but we still see a lot of examples of learning practitioners shouting in our audits. Another very common recommendation we make is that organizations use imagery, which includes every lens of DE&I, and that means including people with a range of disabilities and access needs, not just the one token stock image of someone in a wheelchair that we often see in our audits. And finally, using plain language. So we'll take a bit of time to explore this one in more depth now, not only because it comes up repeatedly in audits, but also because it has such a big impact on making sure that everyone has a positive learning experience. So for me, using readability checkers really has been transformational in improving my own learning content. Although these are built into many of the tools that we use every day, I found two websites particularly helpful. The first is the Hemingway site, which is useful if you're writing your own content because it gives you recommendations on how you can make your language more straightforward. Excuse me. The second is from WebFX, and it's a useful one because it gives a very clear visual score on lots of readability indices. And I found this hugely helpful if I'm working with subject matter experts who may give me very complex language, which I'm trying to work with them to simplify very often in an educational setting. So one practical tip from my own work recently on the DALT program is a method of how to simplify language if it gets identified as being too complex by a readability checker. So I personally find this can be a very time-consuming process. So partly because I couldn't do a presentation in 2023 and not mention AI, but mainly because I found it hugely helpful, I ask ChatGPT to rewrite my language to different reading levels. And then I use an amalgamation of my own words and some of the simplified sentences from ChatGPT to come up with content at a good reading level that I'm happy with. So the recommendations for making content more inclusive that we've focused on promote a positive learning experience for everyone, and they ensure that everyone with access needs feels considered and welcomed. As I said, none of them are WCAG standards that you can pass or fail. But this is exactly what we're going to focus on now in this next practical accessibility tip section. So all of the tips we're going to look at now will help us to pass one of the 50 WCAG level A and AA standards, which, as we mentioned earlier, are a legal requirement for many organizations and best practice for everyone else. I've chosen these particular issues that we'll focus on because I wanted to make sure that we cover a full range of access needs: vision, hearing, motor, and cognitive. And also because they all feature in the Ella Hub list of the 10 most common WCAG standard fails that we still identified in our learning audits. So we're going to start with color contrast between text and background. Then we're going to look at color alone used, especially for feedback. Then focus on captions, how sometimes they're not used or the captions aren't synchronized, descriptive, or accurate. Then we're going to focus on inaccessible interactions used, for example, drag and drop interactions, and finally looking at moving content with no learner control. So we'll start with a standard which includes people with a whole range of vision access needs. And I'm sure this is one which is very familiar to so many of you, but I still think it's worth being aware of because it's still one of the most common WCAG standard violations which we come across in the audits that we carry out. Now, although there are no statistics for accessibility in the L&D industry, I'd imagine if there were that they would be very similar to those that you can find in the WebAIM Million report, which every year analyzes the accessibility of the top 1,000,000 global websites. Now, in their 2022 report, they identified that a huge 83.9% of homepages still fail the requirement for color contrast between text and background color. So the key thing to be aware of, I think, where lots of people find this difficult and we see errors coming up, is that what when it comes to making color accessible, it's that it applies to the contrast ratio between two colors. So the minimum WCAG contrast ratio for text in the background it appears on is at least 4.5 to 1. Of course, I'm sure many of you know that's very difficult to check just by relying on your own vision. Impossible, I'd say. So I want you just to have a guess. Again, nothing, don't need to put anything in the chat unless you want to, but just guess whether the white text against the pale green circle background in this infographic would have good contrast and pass the standard, or poor contrast and fail the standard. Okay, so let's check now to see if you were right. This is the WebAIM color contrast checker. I'm sure, again, as many of you are aware, there are a lot of different options available, but it's the one that I tend to use a lot and tend to recommend because it's just a website, so you don't need to download anything. So you can either manually enter the color values of the colors you're working with into the fields, or if you don't have the color values you're working with, it's exceptionally super quick and easy to check the contrast between your text and the background it's on. I'll show you how it's done now. It's simply a case, so hopefully my video is working here. Brilliant, I just see my little arrow moving. It's simply a case of using the color picking tool to pick up the color value of the background and then text, and then selecting enter to find out if your color combination passes or fails the WCAG standard. So you can see the color contrast ratio for the white against green was only 2.22 to 1, not at least 4.5 to 1. So this would fail in an audit and it would be difficult for many of your learners to see. But another reason we love this color contrast checker is because it makes it so easy to correct your color choices. Again, I'll show you how now. Again, just check my arrows moving. So you can see it has a lightness slider for each color, which means you can simply lighten or darken your chosen colors to get the color values which pass the WCAG standard. So if it's so easy to do, why do so many organizations still get it wrong? And this is where my consultancy really delivered some useful insights. What I found is that organizations very often have a color brand palette, which looks similar to this with just a selection of individual colors that can be used. Whereas what people actually need from an accessibility point of view is a brand palette which analyzes each of the colors in combination and identifies which pass and which fail. Luckily, there's a color contrast checker which does exactly this. It allows organizations to provide workable, accessible brand guidelines around color. And it's also useful for practitioners who might want to make sure that they're using brand colors to avoid issues with their text against background color if they don't have an organizational one. So this brings us to our next common issue for vision access needs, and this time it focuses on learners who have colour vision deficiency, CVD, otherwise known as colour blindness. This example shows how conveying information using colour alone can make it impossible to process if an answer is right or wrong. Because the answer changes colour to red if it's placed in the wrong segment of the Venn diagram, and to green if it's in the correct segment of the diagram, this would fail the WCAG standard. This is because it's using only colour, not using any other device such as text or icons to convey this information. And that means that someone who's colourblind would very likely not be able to interpret this information. So this is how someone with protanopia or red blind colour deficiency would see this feedback. And as you can see, it's barely possible to distinguish between the correct and incorrect answers. So this image was actually created with a colourblind simulator. But you don't need one of those to check the use of colour for feedback. A top practical tip to check this standard is simply to apply grayscale to your content. So you can see a similar issue in example A for this slide, which is based on something that was in an audit that we've done recently. So it only uses a red overlay to tell learners that they've answered the question incorrectly. In contrast, because example B that you can see here uses text and an icon to supplement this information, this feedback would pass the standard. And again, you can see how applying grayscale can really help you quickly double check this standard throughout your learning content. Next, we have one of the most important standards needed to include people with hearing access needs, and that's captions. So the first issue, which I have to be honest, that I'm still staggered to find, is that some videos in learning content don't have captions at all. And this corresponds with research that was shared with me by the charity Scope a few years ago, and they identified a lack of captions as the #1 barrier to equal access learning content in workplace learning. But even if organisations do provide captions, we still see some common issues which prevent them from providing an equivalent learning experience and meeting guidelines. So it's worth a reminder that captions need to be synchronized to the action. So just providing a transcript is not enough. They also need to be descriptive, which means they contain things like important sound effects, who's speaking, the emotions conveyed by tone of voice, which someone who is deaf or hard of hearing may miss. And finally, and where we see by far the most common issues in audits, is that those captions must also be accurate, with punctuation and with no mistakes, so that they're easy to process and understand for everyone. Many organizations fail the caption standard in accessibility audits because they use videos with auto-generated captions which haven't had the punctuation corrected, and they have many grammar and spelling mistakes. So one to be very aware of and to watch out for. So let's move on now to another common issue we often find in our audits, and this time it affects people with motor access needs. So we'll begin with a montage showing some different conditions which affect manual dexterity, both permanent and situational. So these images are a useful reminder, I think, of the various different assistive technologies that people with motor access needs use to interact with digital content. They include things like adapted keyboards, mouse sticks, eye gaze technology, switches, joystick, touch screens, etc. So to include all of these learners and this whole range of assistive technology they use, we need to make sure that all of our content is keyboard accessible. Most of this is controlled by the authoring tool we use, but one thing that we do need to do as practitioners is to find out about which of the interactions provided in our tool are keyboard accessible. So activities such as drag and drop interactions are very often not keyboard accessible, but often there are alternatives provided, such as matching or sequence drop downs that can be used as an alternative. So to meet this standard, practitioners need to avoid interactivity which isn't keyboard accessible, or if they do use it, they need to provide an accessible alternative. And finally, for cognitive access needs, which we have a standard which benefits everyone, but is particularly important for people who have neurodivergent conditions such as dyslexia, ADHD, or autism. It's a very aptly named pause, stop, or hide standard. And it means that if there's any content which starts automatically, lasts for longer than 5 seconds, and appears alongside other content which learners are trying to process at the same time, they must be able to pause, stop, or hide that moving content. So this example shows exactly that. If learners can't control the movement as they can here using the pause button, then this content would pass the standard. Sorry, if they can control it, then it would pass the standard. If they can't, which is often the case in our audits, then they would fail. So I hope everyone, regardless of your role with learning, has managed to find something useful from those practical tips on making learning content inclusive and accessible. And again, you know, if you're a beginner, if you're new to accessibility, or if you're a seasoned practitioner, hopefully you've managed to find something that is useful for you. So I'm just going to finish now with a couple of key takeaways, really, that I'd like to leave you with. So the first is that accessibility can very often seem quite overwhelming. I hope this session has helped maybe to show some ideas of how I try to make it less so, but a mantra that I repeatedly come back to myself and introduce to all of our clients comes from the fantastic accessibility advocate Meryl Evans. And I'm sure many of you are already aware of it, but it really does bear repeating at every possible opportunity, and that is progress over perfection. So things very probably won't be exactly where they need to be now, and you will probably make some mistakes as you try and make your learning content more accessible and inclusive. Certainly it's something that I continue to do as I find out more and more, but every small step you take will have a huge impact on your learners. And that leads me nicely to my next takeaway, which is never to underestimate the positive impact that you're having by making your learning content accessible. It's what I secretly call the joy of accessibility. And it's the magic ingredient which turns accessibility from complex technical WCAG standards into something that really can change the world. Now, in a moment, Luis is going to demonstrate this by playing an extract from a song from the DALC program, and it was recorded by someone called David McDonald to celebrate WCAG version 2 first being released in 2008, a staggering 15 years ago. So if you remember nothing else from this presentation, I hope it's this song. So Luis, if you could play the clip for me now, that would be wonderful.
Just give it a second for it to upload. I mean, for it to activate.
Do you mean you stop sharing? I think, don't you?
Oh yeah, that's what it is. Please stop presenting.
That's
And
it. Sorry,
sorry
yeah,
about
that's
that.
me. Right, it's my technical.
I forgot about that. Okay, it's loading now.
We got a brand new specification. It works with the tool of verification. Makes the web accessible. You know we made it testable. The WCAG. It's gonna make the web understandable, make it perceivable, and make it tangible. When it's interoperable, the web will be unstoppable. The WCAG. We wanna show you the WCAG. We wanna show you what this world can be. We wanna show you the WCAG. It's not a heaven, no, to open up your code and write the WCAG.
Brilliant. I hope you enjoyed that. That's my favorite ever song about accessibility. So if you just bear with me, I just need to share my last slide. My technical. There we go. Brilliant. Hopefully that will load again. Excellent. So just to finish with my final slide, which is a call to action, really. So one thing that I would really love you to do, and how you can directly contribute to making all learning content accessible and inclusive as the default, is to take part in the DALC program taster module. So basically what we've done is we've released 7 lessons from the online self-access program, and you can sign up at the link that you can see on here. Basically, you can just, if you go to the website, which is www.ellahub.net, you'll find a link on that home page, and what you'll get access to 7 free showcase lessons from the program, and also a digital badge if you provide us with feedback. So really the whole purpose of doing that is to get as much feedback as we can to make improvements before we release the full program in October. So we've already had some great recommendations which really have made a great difference to the program, both from an accessibility point of view and from the point of view of learning designers and developers. So we'd really love to hear from you, especially, as I say, if you are a learning practitioner or you have an access need. It would make a huge difference to, as I say, the content that we're releasing in autumn when we release the program, to make it as accessible and as interesting and engaging as we possibly can. So that's my call to action, my last slide to you. So thank you, anyone who would sign up. We'd be immensely grateful.
Excellent, Susie. Thank you so much. That was a wonderful presentation. So informative. Just a quick, I want to just thank Jeremy, who was posting a lot of the links in there during the session. Yeah, thank you so much, Jeremy. I do have some follow-up questions, and everybody, if you want, if you have any other questions that you want to add to the Q&A area, please feel free to do so. Kayleen had this one. If you have time at the end, could you please talk more about the accessibility concerns with learning scenarios and how you address them with the accordion interactions?
Yeah, so I think from the kind of accessibility, it's looking at the tool that you're using, and if you have a conformance report or a VPAT from the tool that kind of does some of the work for you, you can then see whether the interactions that your tool is providing are accessible. And it just happens to be that in the tool that I've used to create that content, in the conformance report, it says that this isn't exactly, I think it's from a keyboard accessibility point of view. So what I tend to do, and even sometimes if I check an interaction and I think, well, it might not be, it might not be that straightforward for people to use, then I will have this, I've developed, as I've been going through developing the program, that the best course of action for me to feel that I really am providing support in case anyone needs this is to provide an alternative. And it happens to be that in the tool that we're using, that the accordion block we know is accessible, and it's something that we can actually just use very easily to provide things like transcripts or images of text if we're using those, put them in an accordion block. So as I say, I'm not sure what the question was around the way that we're doing it. So I suppose that, again, something that I've learned is that in the past, when I provided an accessible alternative, I would just literally give the text, I would just give the answer. But now structuring things slightly differently, just allowing people then to have a similar experience where, for example, you give the scenario, you give them the opportunity to think about it, and then you can give them the answer, on a separate accordion, so that you're not just presenting information to people, that you're still giving people who are using assistive technology the opportunity to think and to have a go at thinking about the question before you provide the answer. So I'm not sure exactly if that's what that's covered what Kayleen was asking.
Let's take a look, Kayleen. Oh yeah, there she gives you a big thank you, Susie.
Okay,
So
brilliant.
I think you hit it. Katie Burke also has a question.
Yep.
Do you have suggestions for making the facilitation elements of training more accessible and inclusive in the situation of presenting a training?
Yeah, so I think that's kind of a whole different something that is a book that maybe my second book that I'm working on, but also a whole new kind of presentation. I think there are so many things that one of the things that I have found incredibly useful about looking at this is if you follow accessibility experts, advocates on social media, particularly I find on LinkedIn, they come up with some fantastic examples of how you can be considering. So you can have things like being an inclusive speaker, and there are things like how to just the kind of making your PowerPoint presentations accessible, for example, making sure that we're following all the kind of accessibility criteria that we're talking here. But I think from a kind of a facilitation point of view, it's a lot of it, I think, is around just being confident that maybe you've thought about different access needs before you start delivering. So very often, I'm sure many people have been in a situation where you might have someone in a training event or and you haven't been told beforehand that they've got an access need. So I think for me, having experienced that quite a few times, the idea of this making everything accessible and inclusive as the default before you begin makes you a much more confident practitioner. So that idea that you might not always get everything right, but if you've considered anybody in your in the session that you're going to facilitate could have cognitive access needs, how can you be a little bit more sensitive to someone who might not want to maybe participate in a group activity? How about thinking about someone maybe with speech access needs, not maybe forcing everybody to speak? If you're thinking about, we tend to be a little bit more aware of vision and hearing access needs, and maybe be thinking of those, and sometimes motor access needs as well. But I think it's that idea of accessibility up front, and finding out as much as you can, going on social media and finding these tips that people are very generously sharing. I think you can find out a huge amount.
All right. Love it. We had a couple more questions got added here. Let's see. This one's from Jared Irvin. Can you talk a bit on how to structure the flow of training for people who are deaf or hard of hearing when the training includes more than one focus point, like in virtual training?
Okay, so that one I'll have to think about. It's not something that I've experienced before. So it's we're in virtual training and we have more than one focus. Is that, are we talking about breakout rooms, for example, or are we talking about having video content and, just chat, ordinary, can you kind of give me a bit more?
Let me take a look at chat here
Background.
and see if Jared is, I think, breakout rooms definitely seems like that would be a big challenge. And Jared, feel free to respond in chat if you can, for some specifics.
So I
Okay.
think coming back to the breakout rooms, if that is the issue, I think it is, again, it's this idea of being prepared and being confident. So certainly in the platform that I used for a long time, I knew that in the breakout rooms, the caption facility when I first started using the platform wasn't actually it didn't function in breakout rooms. So what we had to do was, if if there was someone who was deaf or hard of hearing, we would make sure that they were in the main, we kept them in the main session, and other people, we broke them into breakout sessions, because in the main sessions, we knew that the captions were active. Eventually, luckily, the kind of the functionality of the platform caught up with it, and now the platform we use does have captions in breakout rooms as well. But it is that, you know, it's sometimes you make assumptions that things will work without testing them, or you kind of assume. And I think for me, that's probably one of my biggest progress over perfection is just test everything. That, you know, just be prepared for every eventuality that you can. And that, I think,
No,
is a good
that's
example.
great advice. Jared did follow up with, when you have
Okay.
when you have deaf or hard of hearing participants that
Yeah.
need to watch the captions or ASL, but
Yeah.
facilitators are asking the class to reference another screen or document.
Yes, again, I suppose that is coming back to the thinking of every eventuality. So it's something that I would probably avoid doing myself in any session that I've done. So I'd need to kind of mull over that one and think of how I might be able to make that accessible. I'm sure it must be possible, but it is something that I'd have to kind of think about, and I can get back to you on that one. So
Sure.
email me, or I can carry on the conversation afterwards. So I have to have a think, or as I often say, a mull, and find it's rather than just pretending I know.
Right. No, that's great. That's yeah, that's definitely authentic. I do have one last question, and then we'll wrap it up. Ashley Stout is asking, your slide deck was very clean and easy to read. Where is a good place to find accessible slide deck templates?
Yeah, that's another interesting one about making assumptions, really, isn't it? I think that using templates, what I tend to do, because my background isn't, I'm not a graphic designer, so I will tend to look at templates, for example, in the tools that we use. So I use Microsoft templates, or also the tool that I use. Lots of authoring tools have now slide templates, or learning templates. What I tend to do is use the template as a starting point, and then kind of take the kind of design elements, which I'm not so, which isn't really my field, but then also apply that kind of accessibility, inclusivity to so try and make sure the colors that I'm using are accessible, make sure that the language, make sure that the imagery that I'm using is accessible and inclusive. So I think they're a good starting point. But one of the things that I tend to do, and again that we see quite a lot in audits that we carry out, is people, when we're coming back to learning content, who are using templates, and it's the same, I think, in a lot of templates, is they make the assumption, for example, that the color contrast is accessible, and they use the same colors, and very often it just needs to be, you can use a tool like the WebM contrast checker just to make sure that the colors that you're using are accessible. So very often it can come down to using, if you like the colors of a template, it might come down to just darkening them slightly, and then so it's making sure that you're meeting the standards that you need to for the guidelines.
Fantastic. And there is a lot of comments in the chat for some suggestions. I saw Cynthia had a nice one in there about Microsoft has some accessible templates available.
That's true. Does as well. Yeah, that is true. Yeah. Good.
Yeah, and then Kayleen just posted a blog post about creating accessible PowerPoint templates. So check out the chat.
Brilliant.
There's some great stuff in there. And Susi, you are definitely a leader in this space. It is, I mean, that was a fantastic session. I just want to thank you so much for sharing with us and enriching this community with your knowledge. It was really, really brilliant. So thank you so much for being here and spending time with us today.
Thank you so much for having me. It's been an absolute pleasure. You're doing an amazing work.
Thanks, Susi. And everybody, I make sure I did post the link to Susi's 2021 presentation at the top of the chat. So I'm sure that you want to learn more from Susi. That is another great resource for you. And then also you can find Susi's book available. Let's see. I think I have, I do have an Amazon link to it. I'll drop in real quick just in case. And
thank you.
With that, I'm going to go ahead and wrap it up. We're a little bit over time, but it was worth it. Thank you so much, Susi.
Okay.
And hopefully we'll see you again soon.
Brilliant. Yeah,
Bye,
have a
everybody.
great rest of the day.
Thanks.